In this episode, I'm going to give you a brief overview of how and why Hitler led Germany into the Second World War. I think a good starting point is to emphasize how much Hitler from the early 1920s had a coherent, albeit deeply repulsive, worldview. He saw everything in profoundly quasi-Darwinian terms. Life was about who was the stronger, and the strong should take from the weak because that was their right. Not just that, but he also saw the world in purely racial terms. He wanted a Germany filled only with people the Nazis considered racially pure. And in this context, he thought the Jews were particularly dangerous. Remember, he believed the Jews were a race, not an ethnic group or a religion. Plus, he subscribed to a whole host of conspiracy theories about Jews that were in reality lies. At the very least, Hitler wanted Jews denied German citizenship, restricted in the professions they could work in, and for them to be subjected to other forms of persecution. Though before the outbreak of the Second World War, he hadn't yet instigated the Holocaust, it was always clear that the Jews were a special target of his. In geopolitical terms, he saw Stalin's regime in the Soviet Union, today's Russia, as controlled by the Jews, an idea which was as much a fantasy as his other conspiracy theories about the Jews. But nonetheless, he thought this was a danger that needed to be confronted. Alongside this, he openly called in Mein Kampf, the book he'd written in 1924, for Germany to try and gain territory in the western part of the Soviet Union in order to create a new empire. He believed Germany, in a phrase of the time, was a nation without space, and Germans needed land for expansion and to gain extra resources. So it was no accident, as I mentioned in the previous episode, that one of the first meetings he had on coming to power in January 1933 was with leading German generals. Here, in secret, he told them frankly that an option he was strongly considering in years to come, once the army was sufficiently rearmed, was to fight a war of expansion in the East. To that end, his absolute priority in economic terms during the 1930s was rearmament. It was vital, he thought, that Germany should possess powerful armed forces. Where he was both shrewd and duplicitous was in his cloaking of his real desire, an empire in the East, with his call for the terms of the Versailles Treaty, signed after the First World War, to be changed. And in one of his first acts to challenge the terms of Versailles, in 1936, he authorized the reoccupation of the Rhineland, the area in Germany that had been demilitarized as a result of Versailles. And while there were diplomatic protests from abroad, the Allies had no appetite to take military action to enforce the terms of the treaty. That's the background against which 2 years later, in 1938, 4 events of crucial significance occurred on the road to war. 3 of these events are fairly well known, and one of them isn't, but ought to be. The first of the well-known events that year was the German Anschluss with Austria. There had been years of tension between Germany and Austria, and Hitler now sought to resolve them on the 12th of March 1938 by moving German troops into the country. This violated the terms of the peace treaty signed at the end of the First World War, which specifically forbade Germany to unite with Austria. But once again, there was little opposition from the British and the French. After all, who, 20 years after the First World War had ended, was prepared to go to fight to stop German speakers uniting with other German speakers? The success of the Anschluss with Austria was transformative for Hitler. Franz von Papen, the former Chancellor, later wrote that Hitler in March 1938 in Vienna was in a state of ecstasy. Hitler's success, in the face of all the warnings he'd been given that this action might lead to disaster, had a profound effect on him. The result, Papen wrote, was that Hitler became impervious to the advice of all those who wished him to exercise moderation in his foreign policy. The second important event that year is one that isn't so well known as the Anschluss, but as I say, I think it ought to be. And it's something I think that's vital to understand on this road to war. Shortly after the Germans moved into Austria, the American President Franklin Roosevelt called for an international conference to discuss the problem of Jewish refugees. It was a growing problem because the Nazis were forcing enormous numbers of Austrian Jews out of the country. Consequently, an international conference was held at Évian in France in the summer of 1938. Here, a whole variety of nations got together to talk about what should be done. But this conference was from the very beginning something of a sham. Because from the start, every country invited knew that they weren't going to be pressed into taking large numbers of refugees. The painful reality was that the conference was essentially a public relations exercise, convened to make it look like the world cared about what was happening to the Jews, while offering little in terms of practical help. Hitler and the Nazis would have been pleased, of course, if other countries had agreed to take all the Jews out of the Reich, after, of course, they'd been robbed of their wealth. But it was soon obvious to the world that the Évian Conference was essentially a talking shop, and almost nothing of substance was accomplished. Golda Meir, later Prime Minister of Israel, witnessed personally the combination of hot air and hypocrisy that characterized the Évian Conference. She wrote that she felt a mixture of sorrow, rage, frustration and horror, and wanted to scream at the delegates that these numbers they were discussing were human beings, people who may spend the rest of their lives in concentration camps or wandering around the world like lepers if you don't let them in. As for the Nazis, their view of the outcome of the Évian Conference could not have been more blunt. The headline of their paper, the Völkischer Beobachter, on the 13th of July 1938, was "No one wants to have them," with the strapline, "Fruitless debates at the Jew conference in Évian." Hitler, in a speech at Nuremberg 2 months later in September 1938, ridiculed what he called the hypocritical actions of the democratic empires. Germany, he said, was criticised for acting with cruelty against the Jews. But then the same democratic countries who voiced this attack refused to accommodate the Jews, saying there is, regretfully, no space for them. Hitler's focus on the hypocrisy of Western governments in turn reinforced how many Nazis felt about what they called the Jewish problem. After all, they argued, if it wasn't really a problem, why didn't these other countries agree to take the Jews? Only the Nazis were prepared to be honest and face up to the supposed threat of the Jews. At least that's what Hitler claimed. Shortly after Évian came the third significant issue of 1938, the crisis over the Sudetenland, the borderlands of Czechoslovakia, an area which was predominantly German-speaking. Hitler announced that he wanted these Germans for the Reich, but it was a smokescreen. He actually wanted all of the Czech lands, and he appeared to be prepared to risk war to do it. As I think most of you will already know, war was averted because the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, along with the French, managed to do a deal with Hitler by which the Sudetenland was given to Germany. The deal was signed in Munich at the end of September 1938, without the Czechs even being present.
Arrival from the conference.
We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
It was one of the most notorious examples of appeasement in history. This all laid the ground for the final significant event in 1938, Kristallnacht, the so-called Night of Broken Glass. Kristallnacht on November 9th, 10th, 1938 was a Nazi-led pogrom triggered by the assassination of a German diplomat by a 17-year-old Jewish man. Synagogues, Jewish businesses and homes were destroyed. Over 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and around 100 people were killed. It all marked the intensification of violent acts against Jews and demonstrated the true nature of the regime to the world. In the first months of 1939, events rapidly escalated on this journey to war. Hitler decided to break the Munich Agreement and occupy the Czech lands, entering Prague on the 15th of March 1939. Britain and France, alarmed by Hitler's aggression and his obvious untrustworthiness, now offered security guarantees to Poland and Romania in an attempt to deter further Nazi expansion. Then Hitler and the Nazis did something truly extraordinary. In August 1939, they signed a non-aggression pact with their greatest ideological enemy, the Soviet Union. How, you might ask, could Hitler have got himself into a position where he agreed a deal with the very country that he'd previously said he wanted to attack, while at the same time he was about to go to war with Britain, a country he had until recently wanted to work with as a friend? Hitler admired what he saw as the British achievement in creating a vast empire around the world. Moreover, he saw Britain as a sea power and Germany as a land power. So it might be possible, he'd thought for many years, for these two great powers to come to some arrangement. And he'd been disappointed by Britain's refusal to do some kind of deal with Nazi Germany. So now, from Hitler's perspective, to put it simply, he was about to fight the wrong war. The reason he got into this position, I think, was because of his unusual leadership style, at least in part. As I've emphasized throughout this episode, Hitler had a long-term vision, which was to win an empire in Eastern Europe. Plus, he was capable of seizing short-term opportunities as they came along. What he lacked was the ability to connect his short-term actions with his long-term goal. This disconnect meant that he could end up making a short-term decision, like the non-aggression pact with Stalin, that completely contradicted his long-term vision, which was to create an empire carved out of the Western territories in Stalin's Soviet Union. It was against this somewhat confusing background that, as everyone knows or ought to know, the German army invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, and the British and French declared war 2 days later on the 3rd of September. In the next episode, I'm going to talk about the nature of this war and explain how we need to understand that from the very beginning, this was for the Nazis a special sort of war, one with racism at its core.